Thank you very much. So I am beyond excited to share with you a project that we've been working on for the better part of the year, which is a research project called the Moving World Report, with over 400 sources of data condensed ultimately into a mechanism to articulate the trends that are changing everywhere all at once within mobility. So you were all the first to see this. This is being released at the WGS, and we have some provocative thoughts about what's happening in the world around us. And I'll start first with this bold statement that hunter-gatherers, our ancestors, would look at the things that we're creating today and think of us as gods. I mean, the incredible ingenuity from quantum computing to F-22s to starships to humanoids to flying cars, all this is happening around us, and we should be proud as a race that this is happening. And in fact, if you look at some of the metrics around humanity, things are rather good. When you look at GDP and life expectancy and people not living in extreme poverty, we've had this asymptotic increase in the quality of life across the planet. Now, yes, there are things that aren't great everywhere, but in general, the trend is something that's positive. And in fact, you can directly attribute that line going up to technology. And these key moments in technology and these different industrial ages that we were talking about this morning that have transformed the way we live our lives in a more democratized way. And so there's lots of different technologies you see here, from the steam engine to the Gutenberg printing press to flying cars and the things we talked about earlier today. And so with that, our ancestors, not many generations ago, our grandparents would look and say, wow, you have created the world that we could only dream of. And we're starting to exhaust the level of our own dreams. We looked at the cost to move a pound of payload across multiple modalities, from ships to space to cars to rail. And over the last 200 years, there's been a precipitous decline of approximately 4% per year. This is extraordinary, that what we have done as a humanity writ large in terms of making the movement of things more democratized. And if you extrapolate that out to about 2050 or so, you could make a case that it becomes almost free to move a pound of payload, in the same way that it's almost free to have internet access today, whereas not too long ago, it was very, very expensive. Then the question is asked why? Why is this happening? And I'd argue to you that it's the convergence of these exponential technologies that are all happening at the same time that are allowing us to create, as I shared earlier, our greatest dreams to come true. Everywhere, all at once, everything is changing around mobility. What you're looking at here is from short distance mobility with micromobility with scooters, all the way to infinite travel with rockets. There's a Cambrian explosion around mobility that's all happening. And this is just a small subset of the companies that are in and around this space. But we have this vibrant new community of startups and big companies, little companies, all working together to collectively transform the way we move people and goods. Now we'll shift topics a bit into what is most definitely a changing world order, particularly in and around this region. And I start with this Ray Dalio quote. When he shares, in 1945, we began a new world order. There's always some kind of conflict at the beginning, and the systems change. Now, new folks are in charge, and they set the rules. And you could argue that there's some new rules perhaps come into play. This is a really important thing to take away from this talk. The single largest customer and driver of mobility-related technologies is the United States Department of Defense. We heard from the speech earlier around Silicon Valley was really developed because of the Department of Defense in the United States. And you'd be shocked at how many technologies we take for granted today in our daily lives that all came from dollars that were spent by the United States Department of Defense. The microwave oven was accidentally created by a radar engineer who was messing around with some things and walked by and he had a chocolate bar in his pocket, and that chocolate bar melted very rapidly. He realized he could create heat through a microwave oven. GPS satellites that we use for Uber in our phones, all of that was paid for by the US government to track Russian submarines during the Cold War. The list can go on, but so much of the innovation is brought through conflict, which is a bit of a paradox, that conflict is what causes us to innovate and create new things. How many of you have iPhones in the room? Most of you. Well, you can thank Uncle Sam for your iPhone, because almost every single key technology within the iPhone was paid for either by the Department of Energy, the DoD, the DARPA, you name it. The core enabling technologies were funded by governments. And so the comment that was made between Bill Gates and Elon earlier, we can see that's manifested even in your iPhone. So if we look at the world through that lens, and through technology and conflict, in some ways, while it's sad, it can give you some hope that there is a silver lining as we continue to move forward through humanity. Now, the second largest consumer of mobility-related technologies today is China and the Chinese military. And when you compare the two side by side, the US Department of Defense and the Chinese People's Liberation Army, you can see that you're approaching, at least public numbers, parity. More troops for China, more airplanes for the United States, a lot more ships for the Chinese People's Liberation Army, so on and so forth. So you have a near peer that's reaching peer parity that's causing a lot of activity, particularly in the Western world around development. Now this slide, you should study. This was the result of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's analysis of 44 critical technologies and what country is the quote-unquote leader. And the outcome of that research was that 37 out of 44 technologies were led by China. That's a shocking sort of takeaway from this analysis, and perhaps a wake-up call for countries around the world to look at what's happening and to ensure that we continue to innovate and to compete. And so as we look at some of the examples of what's happening in China, from 2008 to 2020, where they had effectively no high-speed rail to proliferation of it, that's empire building. Again, they've done this before. This is a really fascinating set of data here. And it takes a minute to understand what you're looking at. That dot is the effective center of GDP of the world. And it starts from 1 AD. The average of where the wealth in the world is about over India. So it's mostly in the east. And as from 1 AD on, it started to march to the west, and it peaked in the west around the end of World War II and has been moving back to the east. And the proliferation of success in this region, led by this country, is a big driver, along with the rise of India, the rise of China, and all the other Southeast Asian countries. So there's an absolute shift in terms of economic power in the world that's been happening and it's continuing to happen based off of current analysis. Now, this is a controversial statement by a well-known entrepreneur in the United States by the name of Palmer Luckey, who invented the Oculus virtual reality goggles and now is the CEO of Anduril, which says, "You can't tell your kids to follow their dreams when their dreams suck." Now, what are the dreams today of kids, at least in the West? The top 3 dreams are to become a social media influencer, to become a professional gamer, or a YouTuber. Go back to 1971. What was the number 1 job? Astronaut. And so you could distill that to you may have a systemic structural educational challenge. Now, the slide on the right, what we're looking at is the number of PhD students by country. And you can see in China, 2020, almost 4 million compared to the other countries on there. So a reshift to STEM technologies and higher level education can really help change this narrative. Now, as we talk about conflict and what happens as a result of conflict and the proliferation of new technologies, this is the United States Department of Defense budget as a function of time, and you can see it's got a very predictable peak and trough in and around conflicts that are listed on top. And on the right-hand side is the direct correlation of venture capital investment and government funding of these types of businesses because of the need of the Department of Defense. Really interesting cultural shift that has happened in Silicon Valley. Back in 2018, Google employees sent a letter to the CEO, Sundar, and said, "We are not in favor of you working with the Department of Defense through some of your programs, and we are asking you as our leaders to stop doing that." Fast forward to today, over 1 out of 3 Silicon Valley employees wants to work in defense-related projects. There's an awakening happening around what's happening in the world in such a way that's creating entrepreneurial spirit, innovation, in a way that our generation hasn't necessarily seen. So now let's shift to space. There is so much happening in the world of space, and there's a really interesting quote from a Russian cosmonaut. It doesn't matter what country or what political system you're from, space brings you together. And it was enlightening to hear that the UAE here, as part of the celebration of the 50-year anniversary of the country's existence, one of the moonshots was to send a UAE citizen to space, and your country was successful in doing that, and creating a space program that sent a probe to Mars. And there's something about space that brings us all together in a really unique way. Now, the space industry is growing exceptionally rapidly. Constellations, satellites, up 10x over the last 4 years. Dollars spent, 3x over the last 10 years. Most of that growth, the big green here in the constellations, that's SpaceX with their Starlink constellations. And on the right, you're seeing the dollars being invested in the space continue to go up. There's a lot of data on here, so I'm going to try to unpack this for you. On the left-hand side is number of launch attempts per country. You can see it was not that different for quite a while, and then the United States shot through the roof. Well, you can directly attribute that to one person, one company, that's SpaceX. And on the right, you have the cost of getting a pound of payload to space. That slide earlier I showed you, this precipitous decline of 4% per year, almost getting free to get something moved. You look at the projected cost of Starship is almost free to get a pound of payload to space. This is extraordinary. What does that mean when you can create a railway to space? What economies can be created? What technologies can be created? This is a key enabler that we have yet to understand really what the implications are when, and I assume it's going to work, SpaceX is able to get Starship up to space. Now, this is a different analysis of the pounds of payload to space by launch provider. The very top line, pretty prominent, is SpaceX. If you add up all of the other providers, every other country, SpaceX is still 4x larger. It's extraordinary. Now, we were just talking about this parity and challenge between the West and particularly China. And Elon says here, most people don't recognize how far along their program is. In fact, they're landing rockets. This is extraordinary how fast China is leaning into the space industry. In fact, they have many, many companies that are all competing to go take apart their share of the space ecosystem. Now, in the United States, we have something that's been approved called Project Artemis, which is the U.S.'s mission to get back to the moon. To get a ton of payload to the moon during the Apollo program cost $36 billion. If Starship works getting to the moon, it's going to cost $70 million per ton of payload. What are the consequences of that? What new lunar economies can be created as a result of that? Two companies to keep your eyes on. Blue Origin, company founded by Jeff Bezos. They're expected to launch their rocket this year. And now we've got a real competitor coming into the space. Another competitor that is a really interesting, exciting company that's launching soon is a company called Stoke Space. And I encourage all of you to pay attention to them as they'll be in the news as we go forward. At the opening talk this morning, we heard from Airbus around all the things that are changing in aviation. And I will go on and continue and say everything, everywhere, all at once is changing in aviation. And this is a mind-boggling statistic that only 1 out of 5 human beings living on the planet today has ever flown, period. We have 80% of humanity to bring online as it relates to mobility at a larger scale beyond getting into a car. So what does that do to the economy as you're able to bring more people online? And there's so many areas where we're seeing innovation, from systems to drones to eVTOLs to electric conventional takeoff and landing airplanes to hydrogen to supersonic, all these areas. It's mind-boggling. I do this as a day job, and I have a really hard time keeping my head above water in terms of all the change that's happening. I'm going to make a provocative statement. Outside of the war in Ukraine, the single largest driver of drone technology in the world is a little company called Walmart based in Bentonville, Arkansas. Largest company in the world. But Walmart just announced not too long ago that 1.8 million residents in the Dallas-Fort Worth area will begin receiving drone delivery. They have partnered with some of the most impressive companies, Google Wing, you heard about earlier, with Zipline and a few others. But they have actually made this work and are pushing that ecosystem in a way that we haven't seen before. And you analyze the other large 800-pound gorilla with Amazon, a very different state of the union. Amazon tried to do it all themselves. Walmart did it all with partners. And you can see that there's definitely a leadership position that Walmart has as it relates to their drone delivery program. Now let's talk about cost to get a pound of something moved via drone versus a delivery van or electric van. It's about $4 per delivery versus about $10 for ground delivery. This is a sea change. And this stuff only really works if it is cheaper, because our economy will be pulled into activating these sorts of tools. If you look at the last handful of years, extraordinary growth in drone delivery, millions of deliveries per year. I can only imagine in 10 years from now what this number looks like, and it'll really transform the way we receive things on the ground. And it's not just drone delivery. There's lots of different applications around this type of technology, from automation in factories and warehouses to long distance and medical supplies and military applications. You're going to continue to see a lot of innovation in and around this space. We have an existential crisis with aviation right now that wasn't much talked about on stage earlier, which is pilots. Between now and the year 2030, we're expecting to have 65,000 pilots short. Well, what is the consequence of not having pilots? We can't take off with those planes. We can't get to as high a frequency of delivery. We can't get costs down. Services will be shut down in secondary markets, and it's already happening. Safety will be affected. This is a real problem for governments to be paying attention to be making investments in students to become pilots and education and to be inspired. You can see a quote here from Cathay Pacific that they've had to increase the pay by 25% for their captains. Well, where do those dollars go? Those get passed on to consumers. Those tickets will go up in price. Very famous investor by the name of Peter Thiel has a very famous quote back in 2013. He said, "We wanted flying cars. Instead, we got 140 characters," referencing Twitter. Well, I would say to you, Peter, it took us an extra 10 years, but we got flying cars. In fact, I sit on the board of this company, Pivotal, which is an electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicle company, which you can buy today. You can fly today. You don't need a pilot's license today. It's practically free to fly. Go back to the slide I shared with you earlier about the precipitous drop in cost to be able to move a pound of payload. Companies like this and the others we talked about earlier are actually making that dream come true. There are close to 400 companies developing some sort of flying car. This is an unprecedented time around innovation. I'm not going to go through all of these, but there is a lot going on. And unfortunately, I hate to say this, as a huge fan of the industry and an investor in it and an aviator for 30 years, most of them won't survive. This is a very hard business to be successful in. And we'll see a lot of consolidation and companies work to get to the top. One of the key areas is infrastructure. We heard JoeBen earlier speak about the infrastructure investments that UAE is making. There's one company in particular in the United States called Beta Technologies, which has worked with a lot of the other competitors to onboard onto one system, which is their system. So we're seeing sort of the divide of charging infrastructure systems, and already launched many of those charging locations throughout the United States, and we'll continue to see that in different markets around the world. But now I come back to China. China is not sleeping in this space. They just recently got their first official type certificate and started commercial flight operations with their eHang product. There are people that are paying money to get into a flying car today in China and moving about. This is not a thing we have to wait for anymore. It is happening real time. And we should all be very excited about this. But this competition is very, very real. Now let's talk about the commercial airline industry. And this is a pretty eye-opening sort of statement. Patrick Collison is the co-founder of one of the largest fintech companies called Stripe. And he tweeted this not too long ago. As of later this year, the commencement of the design of the Boeing 737 will be closer to the Wright brothers' Kitty Hawk flight than it will be to today. And if you look at the original 737-100 and the MAX 8, you kind of have to squint and you can't really tell a whole lot of difference. Now, granted, there's been a lot of technological changes, but most of those changes have been in the engines and in the avionics. There hasn't been really wholesale changes in the airframes of aircraft in the way that we commercially move about. Now, I'll offer to you that that's changing. And I'll give you two very specific examples. There's a company called Jet Zero based in Southern California that just won a $250 million contract from the United States government to develop a blended wing-body air-to-air refueler. There's something very special about this design. It cuts the fuel burn by about 50%. There's really interesting things you can do. And our friends from Airbus are also pursuing this idea of a blended wing-body. This is transformative around the way we think about how we build airplanes. And we're going to continue to see a lot of innovation in and around this. The company on the left here, Heart Aerospace, just recently announced $100 million being invested into them to develop an electric regional aircraft. There's a tremendous amount of activity in this space. Now, the truth is, if you were to electrify every single flight less than 2 hours, you're only going to affect about 28% of the CO2 emissions around aviation. Majority of the CO2 emissions in aviation come from long-haul flights. And right now, other than doing an airframe shift or changing the source of the gas to sustainable aviation fuel, hydrogen-based fuel, you're not going to really put a dent into it. So there's some big challenges here, and again, you're hearing from some of the other speakers how they're going down that pathway. And this idea of sustainable aviation fuel is really taking carbon that's already on the surface, collecting it, transporting it, that's hard, then converting it ultimately into a fuel that can be used and burned in traditional jet engines. There is some reality to this. This is a quote from the CEO of Ryanair, Michael O'Leary. He said, "There isn't enough cooking oil in the world to power 1 day of green aviation." So the amount of feedstock required to be able to go down this path of sustainable aviation is still a pretty tremendous area of opportunity and growth. We heard a lot about AI earlier today, and I will offer to you that one of the biggest opportunities for our lives to be changed in mobility is around AI. And this is a great, great quote from a very famous computer scientist, Larry Tesler, that AI is pretty much everything that hasn't happened yet. And we're all experiencing this rocket ship of a ride today. We see there's about 7 major areas where you can see AI in mobility, from autonomous driving to autonomous flying, discovering new materials in the warehouses, generative design, the factory, and the last one, perhaps to me, one of the most interesting one is humanoid robots. Last year has been a very difficult year for startups, except if you're in AI. You see a huge increase, that's the green here in AI startups for Y Combinator. And on the right, we heard from NVIDIA earlier, their growth and that the industry just can't keep up with the GPU request. So this mobility space is going to continue to drive a lot of that beyond making pretty pictures with things like DALL-E. And so how does that work? It's using neural networks to be able to train our robots. And robots can mean a lot of different things. It can mean our cars, it can mean our planes, it can be our humanoids to be able to do things for us. Just recently, Tesla released version 12 of their full self-driving software, which is a wholesale change in the way that they actually designed the software, where they threw away 300,000 lines of code and went to a neural network-based training model, which looked at hundreds of millions of hours of video, where, as Elon says, photons in, controls out. And all the early reports is that this is working extremely well. And you can see a pretty fast change in terms of how this is all coming together. Now back to aviation. You don't have to expand your imagination too much to look at the idea of putting a robot in the cockpit that is using this type of technology that can already interact with the gauges and all the things that are in there without having to completely retrofit the airplane. This is a real robot that has been flying a 737 simulator and doing a lot of what's needed to operate an airplane. Now, what's key to success here is training data. Be it training data in the air, or on the ground, or in a factory for your robot. Back to Tesla, as you compare to some of the other autonomous driving companies, at least publicly available information, this was provided by ARK Invest, a technology investor. Tesla has a huge AI training advantage. That training advantage allows you to create a better product as it relates to autonomous driving. A very interesting insight as we look at autonomous driving here. The slide on the left looks at fatalities of pedestrians as a function of time in the United States, continues to precipitously drop until 2008, and then the iPhone comes out, and all of a sudden we see an increase. Now, is that the main driver? I don't know, but it's an interesting coincidence. So, well, what happens when you can start to take people out of focusing on their phones and driving at the same time to having our robots being able to do that in our cars? A lot of those deaths perhaps wouldn't have to happen. And if you even look at today's data with Tesla's full self-driving to all the other competitors, it's already much safer. So this is good for humanity as we continue to go forward. One of the other major players in this space is Waymo, which is also owned by Google. And Waymo is seeing significant expansion in their services. They just expanded throughout all of Los Angeles and pretty much all of San Francisco. And in Phoenix, they now are driving on the highway. Highway driving for autonomous driving is much more difficult than constrained roads, stop signs. When you're going 60 miles an hour, you better make sure that the vehicle knows what it's doing. And then we'll transition just a bit to how AI can show up in other ways in and around mobility, and not the most obvious ways. Making better batteries. It turns out to find new battery chemistry, you literally right now have to go find the different elements, put them in a laboratory, physically test them, and then see if they work. There are billions of different combinations of formulas for batteries. So now with AI, you're able to do that all autonomously and be able to get better technologies to allow us to electrify this world in ways that we've barely seen. Folks, this is just a snippet of our Moving World Report. If you want to see the whole thing, it's being released tomorrow. I really appreciate all of your time and energy here, and look forward to sharing this great future with you all together. Thanks so much.